I realize I haven't really talked about any books lately. I have read a couple of books, and one of the books that I read recently is this collection of poetry called Autumn Sonata, selected poems by Georg Trakl. For those who are unfamiliar with him, he is this Austrian poet who wrote a lot of his work during the First World War, and a lot of his poems are directly related to his experiences as a pharmacist in the early 20th century, as well as his experiences working as a medical officer in around Europe and all these places he was being deployed to. Needless to say, he had a very miserable time as a medical officer during war, and he expresses a lot of his feelings towards it in a very unique way. I don't read a lot of poetry, and the reason why I read this book is because I wanted to kind of read more poetry, and I was just trying to more diversify the kinds of things I was experiencing and reading, and so I kind of stumbled upon this author, and I wish I had the book. I actually just returned it to the library, but he writes in a very specific style that is very lyrical, very much. He presents like 3 or 4 different images for like each paragraph or something will be a certain image, and he'll kind of just present it in a way that is very lyrical in a very detached way. I found personally, it was this kind of detached coldness, and there's a lot of very abstract symbolism that goes on with a lot of his poetry that to a certain extent feels very opaque on a first reading. And I think it's important to really take into account that I am reading this translated. Obviously his he wrote it in, I like to say, German, and as you know, in terms of poetry, a lot of the things that a lot of the like motivations within writing poetry in a certain language, you kind of play into a lot of the structural complexity of the language, and you play into certain puns, and a lot of sometimes you want to make things rhyme, so you choose this, the structures of each line is heavily dependent on the language. So reading this collection of poems, it was very important for me to realize that I was never really able to fully understand his poems, and that it was okay, and perhaps the only real way for me to do so is for me to actually immerse myself in German culture and Austrian culture, and immerse myself in the situation in which he wrote the poems in, and to know the language by heart. And despite this, I was kind of I was able to collect some of my favorite poems. I'll read some of them out loud. I don't remember some of them. I love this one called A Romance Tonight, All Souls, Autumn Evening Song, To the Boy Ellis, Sebastian and Dream, Downfall, Grodek. All these are just gonna sound kind of unhelpful to hear if you're not really familiar with his work, but those are the ones I like the most, and I am very curious about him as a figure because of his very strong expressionism, right? So he was writing in a way that was so expressive in its relation to nature. A lot of his poems were kind of looking at nature, and describing nature as a way to kind of condense more abstract notions and feelings that he was experiencing in his during the war. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really have much to say, but I did read the book recently, and I would recommend checking it out. I think that well, what fascinated me about him was that I read about how he apparently died of cocaine overdose at 27, and 27 is that kind of number that everyone loves branding about. It was just some kind. I don't remember how I read about it. I was looking for poems to read or poets, and this name came up, and he died at 27, and he was apparently very expressionist, so it kind of just drew me to it, and I enjoyed the book. I recommend checking it out. It's called Autumn Sonata, or I'm sure there are many other names, selected poems. But yeah, pretty good. I highly recommend it.